Walking out of this film, it just rocked me. I just was able to relate to it so much. And I don't usually get that with horror films, so that was really a nice surprise. But I know you mentioned before the premiere of the film that you wrote this during a bad breakup, and so I'm curious. I mean, I gotta know, were you Christian or were you Danny?
Well, I know that I've been Christian before, but I put a lot of myself into Danny. So okay. I was Danny when I was writing the script.
Okay, interesting. And then for you, I mean, obviously you played Christian, but was there a character that you related to the most? It doesn't necessarily have to be Christian.
Yeah, I think, as an actor, by and large, the challenge is to invest yourself in empathy for your character, unless he's just an out-and-out, one-dimensional antagonist, which I don't think Christian is. And I do empathize with his lack of capacity to be the right guy for this girl at the moment that she needs it. And as Ari says, I think we've all been each of these people at different times in our lives and at different moments,
Well, and it's interesting that you tell the story through folk horror, and I'm curious, what attracted you to that kind of subgenre as like the perfect outlet to tell what is essentially a breakup story?
Well, if I answer that thoroughly in any way, then I'm sort of spoiling the movie. Mm-hmm. But the folk horror genre did feel like the perfect framework for the breakup movie that I was trying to make. Okay, yeah. But I would say that I was actually drawing even more from, I would say I drew even more from like the cliches and like the overall structure of like a bad high school romantic comedy mm-hmm. than I was actually from even the folk horror genre. And I was seeing, and so it's if anything, it's just you. The way I often work is that I find sort of a genre framework that sort of can support the story I want to tell that's more personal, and then I allow that to sort of just take it to more operatic heights.
Sure, yeah. Well, and you definitely get some of that because of how surprisingly funny the film is. But something that I've just really kind of found fascinating about your work is like you go back to like both features, your short films, and I feel as though like I'm learning more about you through how personal the stories are, and then also through like the thematic through lines of like family and codependency. And so, for you, how important is it to speak your truth and really just put yourself out there?
I mean, I don't really know any other way to work. I mostly because if I don't feel emotionally invested in the story I'm telling, there's no life in it for me. And so, if anything, it's necessary just to propel me through the making of the film, which is just it's very hard to make a movie. And if your heart isn't totally in the story you're telling, and if you're not working from some, deeply personal place, I don't know how to get through the trial of making the thing.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I'm kind of out of time. I do really briefly, The Bear and the Fish. That was like that's something that just fascinated me throughout the entirety of the film. Can you give me some little insight into like where your head was at when you were using that imagery?
The bear and the...
In the fish, because I noticed the fish at the dinner table, but
right.
Mainly the use of the bear across the board.
I would say, if anything, that's my sense of humor at play.
Tomorrow's a big day.
Is it scary?
What is it?
It has special properties.
What am I going through?
Walking out of this film, I think the first thing that came to mind was like, holy crap, this resonated so much with me because I've been there and I'm able to relate to some of that stuff. So it's such a great story about breakups and grief, and I'm curious for you all if there was a particular character or through line that you really personally resonated with, not necessarily the characters you played.
That's interesting. I think the thing that I related to in a kind of broad sense, and not trying to be evasive of your question, but the fact that it was an exploration in some large part of relationships, whether they're kind of platonic or romantic. I think we're kind of often all sort of finding ourselves reflecting on how we are as friends, or how we are as siblings, or how we are as, a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And I think to see a film that is going to encourage people to reflect on that, and it shows examples of what is kind of constructive in a relationship and what is also like very kind of damaging, it's really interesting, and it's a very accessible sort of entry point for people to get sucked into this world.
Yeah. What about for both of you?
I mean, I tried to play the Pelle part as kind as I was able to, and I hope that I do that in real life as well.
Yeah,
so.
no, I think I got that for sure. But so something else that I found really fascinating was like how the village and the rituals, they weren't inherently like evil or wicked, and it was really, it was the viewpoint through the characters that ultimately like kind of determined their fate. And so I'm curious as to like, what do you think our perception of unfamiliar traditions can tell us about ourselves, or maybe like society, modern society in general?
Well, I'm about to bite off way more than I could chew. I think that there is something interesting in investigating a way in which you can explain the world around you, and I feel like, this story in particular, and like our sort of, I think our repulsion. I think it's sort of stems from the fact that we, looking at life as a cycle, and of death and rebirth, and it should be something that is separate from how we live now.
Sure.
That's something that happened before, that we tell stories about. It shouldn't be something that we currently participate in, and so I think it's really sort of. It's disconcerting to think that there are people that are actually sort of leaning into that idea a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I got one final question for you all. So as we all know, Ari has this ability to linger ever so slightly on just the most disturbing images. And so I'm curious for you all, is there a particular disturbing image or like horror scene from just horror films in general that's kind of stuck with you through the years?
Oh. Like the ending of Kill List.
Yeah.
That is just the most horrifying thing I've ever seen.
That's a deep cut.
That's a good one. Yeah.
We all watched that together in Sweden, right?
Yeah.
No, in Hungary.
In Hungary. Sorry, I was in character, so I
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great film to close out on. Thanks so much for your time. Great film.